maybe the secret to how you feel and your mood could be lie in your gut and your gut microbiome.
Well, we like to start with a little bit of science. We are going to exclusively, primarily talk about the gut-brain axis, but let's just start with the gut microbiome in itself. How would you describe that to someone who's not familiar with the topic?
Yeah, so the gut microbiome really is the trillions of microorganisms that we have on and in our bodies. And by microorganisms, by definition, these are things we need a microscope to see. And we mainly think of this in the context of bacteria, but there are others. So we shouldn't forget about the fungi, the archaea, the viruses, and other single cellular organisms. But for the most part, we're really talking about bacteria, and most of this bacteria is present in our gut, and that's why we often talk about the gut microbiota.
And then thinking exclusively now about the gut-brain axis, do you mind just describing that as well to someone not familiar?
Yeah, so I guess if you're not familiar with this, you probably still use it in your everyday language. You have gut feelings, gut instincts. You're gutted when you're disappointed. You make gutsy moves when you're brave. You have butterflies in your tummy if you're nervous. So, for a long time, we personify our emotions in our gut. And what the gut brain axis is basically the physiological pathways that enable communication between what's going on in our gut and what's going on in our brain. And it's a bi-directional communication. And there are different components to it, Owen. And I guess one of the key components is the second brain itself, which is called the enteric nervous system. So that's not very well appreciated, that the gut itself has its own nerve cells that are really important for controlling how our gut works. We have more nerve cells in our gut than we do in our spinal cord, yet they don't get a lot of attention. So people just thought that the enteric nervous system was for motility or digestion, but now we really appreciate that it actually is able to communicate with other pathways to send signals directly to the brain. And one of these pathways is called the vagus nerve. And vagus comes from the same Latin origins as vagabond or vagrant. So it means wandering. So it's a long wandering nerve that sends signals from our gut and many other organs to our brain, but also from our brain back to the many other organs. And it helps us feel how we feel. And it's really important for things like interoception. So how our brain is actually able to sense what's going on in our bodies. And of course, with our gut, that includes things like feeling of hunger or motivation to eat. But it's not just eating. We now know it can play a role in much more complex behaviors. And I'm a stress neurobiologist by training, so I'm interested in the impact that stress, both either traumatic stress or chronic stress, has on our brain, but also on our gut and how our gut signals to our brain. And so that's how we've got in. We showed many years ago that the gut brain axis is really important for this. This is also known in certain disorders like irritable bowel syndrome, which is a stress related disorder where you have alterations of the gut brain interactions. And then about 20 years, maybe not quite 20 years ago, but in that period, with advances in microbiome science, when we could start to quantify these microbes in the gut, we started to understand that these microbes, through a variety of mechanisms, are able to communicate with this gut-brain signaling, and that we really have a much more complex microbiome gut-brain axis that's very important. And some of the discoveries and things we've shown here in Cork have been fundamental in positioning the microbiome as a really key regulator of gut-brain signaling, and then of stress-related behaviors, and then all the way to disorders where this may be playing a role.
And in a simplistic sense, how are the microbes communicating with the nervous system?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we can break it down into a number of ways. So one way is you could think of the microbiome as a kind of a factory, producing all kinds of weird and wonderful chemicals that our body wouldn't be able to produce without them. Factories rely on many things, but two of the things factories rely on are the raw materials and the workers. So you need really good raw materials, and you need to make sure your workers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And in the case of the microbiome, the raw materials are coming from the diet, and the workers are the actual bacteria themselves. And so basically we take foodstuffs in, Predominantly, what we study now is fibers from the diet. They're broken down not by the body. The body doesn't have the capacity to break down some of these, but by the microbes. And then they produce key chemicals that can interact with key receptors on the enteric nervous system all the way to the vagus nerve. Or they can produce these chemicals that can get into the bloodstream, and then through the bloodstream, they can circulate and cross the blood-brain barrier to get into the brain itself directly. So that's one key thing that a lot of the field is excited about right now, is understanding what these chemicals, these metabolites, as we call them, can do. The second way is through the immune system. Our microbiome in our gut is really important regulator and programming our immune system. And so we know that that's a really key important way. We now are fully appreciating that the brain isn't immune privileged and is able to receive signals from immune cells outside of the brain, and that they can influence various aspects of brain function overall. The third way is through hormones. The chemicals the microbes make can stimulate the release of hormones from various cells in the gut. These range from hormones that are involved in stress sensitivity to those involved in feeding. One that most people will have heard of right now is GLP-1, which is an important hormone in appetite regulation. And really now, as we understand it, it emphasizes the importance of gut-brain signaling in modulating complex behaviors like how and what we eat.
Now, we often talk about bacteria, like you've just alluded to. Are the other microbes innocent bystanders, or has the research to date been more dominated by bacteria? And do we suspect that the other organisms possibly have an equally important impact, but we just don't fully understand it yet?
It's a great question, Owen. I think it is the latter. We've been interested in the viruses, the virome in particular, of late. And the problem is that the annotation that you need to be able to study these viruses is quite complex. And I had the fortune of collaborating with a good friend and colleague here, Colin Hill, who's a world expert on these. But even with that, we were still only at about 20% of the coverage of what was actually there. And so a large part of the virome is still not fully understood or annotated at all. Anyway, we were interested to see, because I'd shown that stress affects the composition of the bacterium, but we were also interested, does it also change the viruses? And indeed it did. And that was kind of cool. We did this in a mouse study. But then we went one step further and we said, well, what if we took an individual's virome before they were subjected to a stressful situation, and then give it back to them during that stressful situation? And what we found was, in doing so, we could dampen down the effects of that stress on the immune system, on the brain, and on behavior. So that really showcases that we're only touching the top of the iceberg in relation to our understanding of these components. The same with the fungi. And it's important to really conceptualize what's going on in the microbiome in ecology. It's kind of like a rainforest, if you want. So you can destroy all of the trees, and that's what we do when we give antibiotics. But what happens in other things come in and take ownership of where the trees were. And we see this with fungi that start to bloom when you take antibiotics, and you get this fungal blooms that can have some clinical context as well. So it is very much a living ecosystem. They're all working together, and it makes it complex to study, but one appreciates that as we move forward.
Now, what does the evidence demonstrate in terms of gut health and its impact on our mood and anxiety and perhaps stress as well?
The easiest answer to that is, if you've ever had an infection of your gut by food poisoning, you don't feel very well. Your mood isn't that great. We have long accepted that there's a relationship between a bacteria and an infection and a gut infection, and that's able to send signals to our brain to make us feel poorly. Over the last number of years, we're beginning to see this in major mood disorders and other psychiatric illnesses, that there seems to be a signature emerging where there seems to be a loss of certain bacteria that produce key chemicals that I mentioned. Among these are short-chain fatty acids in particular. So we're beginning to see that, whether it's depression or anxiety or various aspects there, that there seems to be a loss of these. And then that leads us to the flip side of it, is, could we target the microbiome to have beneficial effects on mood or anxiety? And the answer is probably, but we're not totally there yet. We coined the term psychobiotic well over a decade ago, my colleague Ted Dine and myself, and we wrote a book about it called The Psychobiotic Revolution, because this was really about how do we build evidence credibly that maybe the secret to how you feel and your mood could be lie in your gut and your gut microbiome. We have some evidence from healthy volunteer studies that we've done here in Cork, and many others have done as well, that certain strains of bacteria may have beneficial effects. We're also trying to test more and more about the impact of microbial friendly diets on mood and stress in particular. We did a nice small study where we showed that individuals with poor diets and stress sensitive, i.e., our student population, that if we fed their microbes, so gave them a diet full of fiber and fermented foods, we would dampen down that stress response. So that was kind of cool. We do need to translate this now to clinical populations, but slowly more and more of them are emerging. And I think that's going to be very exciting for us overall to see what can work and what won't work. And what might work for me might not work for you, Owen. And understanding why that might be is also an important part of the puzzle. We've also seen a quiet renaissance in psychiatry as a discipline, introducing the whole concept of nutritional psychiatry over the last 10 years. The idea that what you eat is really important for how your brain is and how your behavior is. And so, again, large scale studies showing that people with poor diets, with ultra processed food that is low in fiber, are more susceptible to stress related psychiatric disorders, and those that have high fiber and diets enriched in lots of color and polyphenols and fermented foods seem to have better mental health outcomes. Now, these are generally observational studies. They're generally population-wide studies and don't really hit the causality aspects at all, but they're really intriguing, and they help us to be inspired to really come up with the concept that there might be a way of targeting the microbiome that might have widespread impact on overall mental health and well-being.
And what about the reverse? Does mood and stress affect the microbiome?
The answer is yes. We've shown this in our animal studies time and time again. The question then is, so what? But I hope I've told you enough that if you change the microbiome, it might be relevant to how the body deals with things. And so we're really intrigued about how that downstream effect of stress, in particular during early life and at key transition periods in life, how that can have a long-term effect.
Now, I was looking at some of your recent research and you were connecting gut bacteria to daily stress rhythms. Do you mind just expanding on that or explaining what that was?
Yeah, no, this was really cool because this is probably one of the most intriguing discoveries we've made here in UCC in some time. And it was basically an appreciation that our whole body is in a rhythm, and it's a very tightly tuned circadian rhythm. We have a region in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So it's like something out of Mary Poppins, but it is the clock center of the brain. And it ensures that all cells and all parts of our body have a rhythm to them and how they work. And some of this is well known in medicine and very appreciated. Our cortisol, our stress levels are highest in the morning, and we start to see them go down. And what wasn't appreciated up until recently, and it initially came out of work from Israel, was that our microbiome also has a rhythm and it shifts across the day. Now, why is that important? That's really important because it may not be just what we feed them, but when we feed them. That's important. And this might give interesting insights into the world of time restricted eating or fasting in general and the beneficial effects that they may have on metabolism and perhaps mental health, maybe due to being able to filter this in different ways. So that was the first part of the puzzle. And then, as I said, the stress system is tightly regulated with your circadian system. So we, across the day, we could get stressed differently overall. So that's really intriguing. That's well known. But how the stress system and the circadian system are integrated with each other, the regulation of that isn't fully appreciated. So what we showed in our animal studies, when we depleted the microbiome, we lost all control of that normal oscillation. And so that was really, it helps us to start thinking that for normal ability to deal with stress across the day, we needed to have the appropriate microbes in our gut. We also know that this may have consequences to disorders related to circadian rhythms. And we know, for example, major severe mental illnesses, many of them have links with sleep disturbances in particular, and circadian dysfunction, most notably bipolar illness, is very well associated with this overall. So it really is intriguing to see, can we actually understand what is the functional consequences of disturbing our microbiome, and how that kind of long-term effects potentially on what's triggering sleep-related symptoms overall. So I think that's something that I'm quite intrigued about and would love to be following up some more on.
And then what about some other brain, I guess, pathologies like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's? Is there any evidence that gut health is impacting those conditions?
Another great question, Owen. Let's start with Parkinson's. We just wrote a small piece for the Lancet, the Neurology, on this again, to highlight that it needs more attention overall. But what has happened in the Parkinson's field is that there's an appreciation that in a large percentage of Parkinson's disease, there is a body first element to it. And by body first, we mean that the symptoms start to emerge in the body, often the gut. Constipation is often a prelude to diagnosis with Parkinson's, as is REM sleep disturbances. But also from a pathology perspective, or what's gone wrong, we know that Parkinson's results from what we call a degeneration or a killing of cells in the brain that are involved in dopamine production. And dopamine is a key neurotransmitter. But we don't know what triggers that. And what we now know is that there's an ability of in certain Parkinsonian situations, of changes to occur that can travel through this vagus nerve again and basically act to start from a brainstem upwards perspective, start to spread and start to cause degeneration. And that could be quite different to other causes of Parkinson's. So the Parkinson's field is very excited about brain-body interactions in general now. And it might give us some insight into why certain people's Parkinsonian journey might be quite different to others. We know that the microbiome has changed and different in these patients, but we don't know enough yet about how can we recover or slow down some of these effects. There's been some studies doing things like fecal transplants in Parkinson's patients. There's one study showing positive, one study showing negative. So the jury is still out about whether changing the microbiome itself could be sufficient in patient populations to affect that. I think it's exciting. I think it's important, but we're still a bit to go. Regarding Alzheimer's and other dementias, I think it's even a little bit more underdeveloped. It's really developed well in animal models. We know that if you grow up without microbes and you have the genetic susceptibility factors for developing plaques in your brain, amyloid plaques, Alzheimer's plaques, that they won't occur if you grow up without microbes. So we know you need microbes in your gut to develop the plaques that you get in Alzheimer's. And that's quite profound, because then that allows us to start thinking about potential preventative mechanisms overall. But we have some way to go with that. Other neurological syndromes like multiple sclerosis, again, there seems to be clear evidence emerging about the importance of the microbiome, but that's probably not so surprising because of its immune relation and the importance of the microbiome in shaping immune function.
Now, I saw some other interesting research that you were involved in around social behavior in mice. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about what that discovered?
Yeah. So mice, like humans, are quite social. So if you give them the chance to spend time with another mouse or an empty chamber or an object, they'll gravitate towards the mouse. And what we showed, now it's over a decade ago, we showed that if they grew up without microbes, again, these animals that don't have microbes in their gut, they are not able, they don't care. They're not really social at all. They're happy to be alone overall. So that was kind of interesting. And then the second part of what we showed was forming around what we call social cognition. So the ability to recognize others. And mice, like, well, maybe some humans, are a bit fickle. So if you give them the chance to spend time with their everyday playmate versus a new playmate, they'll gravitate towards the new playmate, but not if they're germ-free. And so this finding for us meant that for normal social interactions and your mouse, you need to have appropriate microbes in the lumen of your gut. So that was a big discovery. Really got me into thinking about other dimensions. I collaborated with a zoology colleague and evolutionary biologists, and we started surveying across the entire animal kingdom. And what we found was that if you started to change social hierarchies and dynamics, which often occurs in the animal kingdom, that you change the composition of the microbiome is one of the things you see, and vice versa. If you start to change the microbiome, you also will change these social hierarchies and social domains. And we wanted to look at this in the context then of certain disorders of the social brain, because there's something about the social brain. And by the social brain, I mean the circuits in our brain that are responsive to key neurotransmitters and hormones that we know are involved in social behavior and that are driving us to be more social and to be more affiliative and to work better and to work as a team and to make our decisions based on these social constructs. That's all governed by certain brain areas. That there's something about these brain areas that make them particularly vulnerable to changes in the microbiome. And of course, when we think of disorders of the social brain, there's always people thinking about autism spectrum disorder and other disorders like that. We've been interested in other disorders like social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder is a very common disorder, poorly understood. Probably the only disorder that got better during the pandemic because people were able to stay at home and not have all these social pressures. It really is a disorder of feeling intensely being judged in a social construct. And it's not shyness or introversion. It's really that incapacitating that can occur when you're forced to be in a social construct. And our group here showed, work led out by Mary Butler, a psychiatrist here, showed that the composition of the microbiome is different in patients with social anxiety disorder. And that was kind of neat to see and intriguing. But then we went one step further and we took those microbes and transmitted them to normal, healthy mice. And they developed elements of social anxiety disorder. So that was kind of really cool. Helps us build a more causal link to what's going on overall. So yeah, the implications for all the social brain microbe things is that could we make people be more social and work better together? Could we have enhance the decisions we make in a social context? Could, the Irish football team win better again and again? These are questions that remain. And we really need to understand within normal social behaviors, how much is the microbiome contributing to our ability to want to be with others versus wanting to be alone? And I think there are certain species of animals that can help trying to unlock that. And that's cross-species approach will be important.
You mentioned COVID there. I saw there's some emerging research on gut health and long COVID. Well,
Yeah.
what do we know so far on that subject?
Yeah, no, and it's not something that I'm studying myself. And my colleague here, Liam O'Mahony, has done some really nice work implicating that, again, some of these metabolites that the gut is making may be causing this immune activation, chronic immune activation that might be leading to some of the brain fog and other elements that you see with long COVID, the fatigue elements as well. And everything is plausible and it does need more studying, but there's a lot more focus that changes to the gut microbiome might be a key factor here. But I think we need to stay tuned for more work to be done.
So it's hard to kind of encompass everyone's individual context, but thinking of myself at middle age, I'm relatively healthy, but I just want to ensure that I'm living as healthily now and into older age. Say that I'm not very familiar with the microbiome and I come to you and I ask you, why should I care about this topic? What might it do for me if I can improve my microbiome? Would you have any kind of inspiring messages to kind of encourage action?
It's a great point, Owen. And of course, as someone who also is interested in this middle age period, it's something that I often think about myself. I guess what I'd like to get across is that the microbiome is central to almost all aspects of health, whether it's, of course, gut health, immune health. What we're really interested in mental health. For women, it's really important for women's health. And the evidence is really accruing in that regard. We know it's important to how we might respond to medications, whether it's in oncology or even now in psychiatry and neurology. And we're beginning to really frame it to understand that we have co-evolved with our microbes. They were there first. And so they're kind of our friends with benefits, and we have to understand what these benefits are overall. And while in medicine in particular and in biology, we spent a lot of time focused on genes and the role of genetics, and it's really important. But with your genes, there isn't a lot you can do except blame your parents and your grandparents. What we're really getting to appreciate with our microbiome is that it's something that we can potentially modify, that we can take agency over our own health and be able to affect key aspects of our health. And for my interest, it's in relation to mental health and longevity aspects. And I think that gives us an amazing power, and that this power is within ourselves right now.
Fantastic, which leads on nicely to what we do about it. I presume our nutrition plays a major role. So tell us a little bit about what sort of specific foods are particularly good and maybe which are not so good for the microbiome.
I think there's a real appreciation now of what we can do to, we talked earlier about certain strains of bacteria and probiotics, and certain probiotic strains have been shown through evidence base to have beneficial effects. However, buyer beware. Always ask, is there any scientific evidence that this strain of bacteria in this preparation has ever been shown to have a clinical benefit, or even any data? Because most of what's available commercially has never been tested in any way. So just be careful on that. And some of it doesn't even survive the stomach acids. So really buyer will beware on probiotics. We're a big fan of other approaches here in Cork as well, and particularly those that we could potentially get through the diet. So in addition to probiotics, we have a thing called prebiotics. And that's basically the dietary substances which allow for beneficial bacteria to thrive. And they range from things like inulin, which you will find in leeks and chicory and artichokes, to other types of fibers. And so fiber is king. And so really ramping up your fiber if you can tolerate it. Now, there are certain people, of course, that have fiber tolerability issues and won't suit everyone. But if you can tolerate fiber, you can really ramp that up, because that gives energy. Well, it basically allows the microbes to extract the key chemicals from the fiber to give energy to our gut cells that line our gut, and potentially even those that go to the brain. So that's really important as well. We know that color is really important, because color in our diet indicates the presence often of polyphenols. And polyphenol, I always think it sounds like a 1970s disco queen, but polyphenol is actually really important substances that we see that gives this color, and that can be broken down by microbes to produce key chemicals that are important for health, and also can change the composition of the microbiome. We're doing a study now with colleagues at the University of Ulster and UCLA looking at 1 year supplementation of polyphenols from berries, because berries are a great source of polyphenols in people who are at risk for Alzheimer's disease. So stay tuned in a few years to we'll have that study completed. But our hypothesis is that if there is beneficial effects, it will be through the microbiome changes that are occurring. So get that color, get those polyphenols. They're in green tea, they're in dark chocolate and red wine. We often hear about it, but they're equally in onions and grape juice. So that's really good. I shouldn't just mention the word diversity, because it's a word that's getting a lot of bad rap across the globe. But as in all aspects of life, diversity for your microbiome is really important. And in general, and this is a generality, the more diverse your microbiome is, probably the better it should be. And diversity of diet is one of the things that drives diversity of the microbiome overall. So there are some of the things that we're seeing. My colleague Jens Walter here in Cork has developed what's called a NEMI diet, which is a diet focused on nutrition in an industrial context. So he looked at people who live in Papua New Guinea nowadays and showed that their diets were very different to us in the industrial West, and they have different effects on the microbiome. So if we could emulate what our ancestors ate, probably better for our microbiome. And they've created a cookbook that's available online on the NEMI website, so for free, that people could look at that if they're interested in positive ways affecting their diet overall. And then there's the flip side, as you allude to, on things that we should try and avoid that we know are bad for our microbiome. They range from artificial sweeteners, in particular emulsifiers. Various other aspects of ultra processed food has been shown to be quite negative on the diet. And so again, these are things we should try and avoid as much as we can. But this is everyday life. We're all busy as well, so we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much. We know that things like being born by C-section is negative on our microbiome, so we should try and support breastfeeding as much as possible, because that's much better for our microbiome in early life. But again, these are factors that might be outside our control. Stress, as a stress neurobiologist, is poor for our diet. but also for our microbiome. And then circadian, we mentioned circadian rhythms earlier, but sleep disturbances, jet lag, all that's really poor for our microbiome and it's not good. But there is one other thing that is actually good for your microbiome, and there's something that I tried to keep from my wife and kids, but anyway, I failed, and that is having a pet. And especially having a dog is good for your microbiome. And there is a growing evidence, believe it or not, that pet ownership is good for mental health. And there's a paper just out this week, I think it's from Japan or Korea, showing that teenagers having a dog was very good for their mental health. And they show that this was mediated through the microbiome. So there you go. It gives you, should I say, pause for thought on that one, you know. And I forgot to mention my favorite thing, which is, of course, fermented foods. And fermented foods are really good for the microbiome. And so people begin to study, well, under the consequences of ultra processed foods, if you supplemented with fermented foods, could you actually counteract some of the negative effects? And studies like that are ongoing. But fermented foods, what I love about the concept of fermented foods is that they don't have to be expensive or something that you have to get and pay a lot of money for. And that means that people in the lower socioeconomic classes that could actually potentially benefit from these fermented foods could do better from them. And it helps to democratize some of the concepts that we're generating here, and need to do a lot more work on understanding the biology of what fermented foods is doing to the body.
So that's fantastic. You've obviously alluded to kind of prebiotic and probiotic, giving our bodies more bacteria versus feeding the bacteria already there. Do you think it's a nice balance of both? Or would you say, if you were like, oh my goodness, I can only take on one thing at a time, which would be the factor that's maybe the one to focus on most?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there may be an inter-individual response. So some people may respond better to one approach versus the other, or some people may need both approaches overall. And if we just deconvolute that a little bit, like there's no point feeding bacteria if they don't exist there. So if you've got rid of all the good bacteria through your lifestyle and various approaches, and you're feeding them with prebiotics, if they're not there, or there's been an extinction of some of these bacteria, there's not a lot you can do. So you might need some form of supplementation, either through probiotics or through fermented foods, to try and recover that. But likewise, if you have all the good bacteria, then putting one more strain in there mightn't be sufficient to actually do much else. So it will depend, I think, overall.
I wanted to ask you about extremes of age. So let's start, I guess, at the beginning for children. What do we need to know? And I guess, how permanent is the impact of childhood microbiome development? Like, can we significantly modify our microbiome later in life? Or after a certain period of life, have we've created it and we can maybe change some levels here and there, but it's pretty unchangeable at that point? Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. I mean, there's significant impact of early life microbiome on all aspects of physiology and health. And we know that a variety of factors and exposures, with a lot of focus nowadays on the word the exposome in early life and how it can shift the microbiome in general. Usually the microbiome starts to settle down by 2 years, definitely by 4 years, it's more or less there. And then the question is, if we have disturbances early on, do they leave an enduring effect on the microbiome, A, the resilience of that microbiome, and B, on overall health, and in my particular interest is brain health. And the answer is we don't know enough evidence yet in humans, but we do in animal models, and that is indeed the case, that while the microbiome recovers from disturbances, and that disturbances could be being born by C-section, or exposure to antibiotics, changes in diet, infections, various things like that. While the microbiome will recover, there can be enduring effects later that will allow for increased susceptibility to stress or increased susceptibility to other dietary insults that might occur later on. So there's definitely an importance of early life microbiome for sure.
And then thinking about the other extreme of age, are there any specifics to think about, or is it just kind of maintaining a healthy microbiome into older age? Or are there any considerations for the older listener who is listening at the moment?
Well, there's been amazing work done here in Cork by my colleague Paul O'Toole and colleagues, dating back over a decade ago now, where they took a group of almost 200 people who lived in a nursing home situation, compared them to those that lived in the community, and looked at their microbiomes And what they're able to show is that the people, first of all, aging was associated with a diminution in the diversity of the microbiome, and that those that lived in the nursing home had a much narrower diversity than those that lived in the community. And they went one step further to see what was driving that. And what was driving that was diversity of the diet. So those that lived in the community had a much more diverse diet, lots of that color I talked about earlier, driving increased diversity of the microbiome, leading to better health indices around frailty and other measures. Now, they didn't measure too much around cognitive health yet, but it was really intriguing. So what this means is, for nursing homes, it means that their diets of beige food and lack of diversity is not probably good, so that we need to bring in diversity of diet. And so for the older listeners, I'd give you one thing today is try and increase the colors that you have in your diet and the amounts of plants and vegetables that you take in, because that will be really good for your microbiome.
With regards getting more bacteria in our diet, we've got a few options: the fermented vegetables, the kefirs, the kombuchas. How much of those, or do we know yet, get kind of killed by the stomach acid, or have we evidence to show that they are having a benefit?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and it's a really exciting area, and one that I feel that has been ignored, especially in basic science, because it's a little bit out there perhaps. What we're seeing really is that they do survive and that they can actually get to the gut overall. But another thing that we're beginning to see, and this is brand new work now, is that while the fermentation part is really important, it's also the substrate that we actually ferment can be quite healthy for the microbiomes as well. So the vegetables themselves can actually be positive, as well as the fermentation. So people need to really develop a taste for some of these. I mean, some of the kombuchas are really easy to drink, but others, they're a bit tangy. And so I think as a culture, we should try and upskill our taste buds to be able to take more of these, because they do offer a lot of beneficial effects. And it kind of all goes back to the work of a guy called Eli Mechnikov, the very famous Russian. He won the Nobel Prize in 1908 for discovering what we call macrophages, so basically immune cells that gobble up foreign bodies. And when he got older, when he turned 50, which was old at the turn of the last century, he got very obsessed about getting old and was wondering about how could he live longer and healthier. Not unlike yourself, Owen, very curious man. And he went out to look at, are there parts of Europe where people live longer and healthier? And he saw some villages in Eastern Europe in particular, that there was this clustering of people living longer and healthier. And he wrote a book about this. You can still see the book today. And what he found was what they ate could be responsible for this. And what they ate was a lot of fermented foods containing lactic acid bacteria. So he's one of the fathers of basically geriatric medicine in a way, and the father of probiotics in another way. And so, it is quite intriguing. So all of this has been known for a long time, that fermented foods really could have a beneficial effect on helping healthy aging and helping our brains throughout. And if there's one thing I would encourage people to do, is look at how do you increase the amount of fermented foods you can get into your diet, because it might actually help your overall lifespan.
Okay, so social media is responsible for a lot of, I would say, confusion maybe at times. Are there any myths or misconceptions around gut-brain health that you've seen or heard that you would like to kind of dispel?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of controversy about the hype around the microbiome and what it can do, and we have to be really careful and really build a science based on that. And it can be difficult at times. People see it as something outside the body or something that's extra from what we're doing. And I think people need to really understand that we are still at early days of building a science base for understanding the relative contribution of this important inner tube that we have, and how these fellow travelers could actually impact brain and behavior. But they're fundamental parts of us. So we need them for so many parts of how we survive. So I think, when you look at your social media followers and you look at these influencers and what they're saying might be good for your microbiome, always ask the question, where is the evidence? Who has shown it? And who's making money out of what they're saying? Because we really need to democratize this in a way that's going to be beneficial for everyday people.
And then finally, thinking about the future, is there anything on the horizon, any research that you're particularly excited about that may not be prime time yet? Anything that we should know about?
That's also an important part. I mean, I'm very excited about where we can go with tailoring the microbiome for our circadian rhythms. I think I'm only scratching the surface of that right now. I think that's something I'm personally excited about for my own research. And I'm beginning to see that pillars of how the microbiome is gating our circadian system, our immune system, and our stress system, how they're wired together could be really important for healthy aging. And aging begins the day we were born. So, like, I'm talking about aging from day one upwards, and especially at these key transitions. On top of that, then there's a number of really cool innovations that might make prime time in the next 5 years would apply for all aspects of the microbiome field, but would give people more control. We all like to measure stuff. We all have, the smart watches and we're monitoring everything. What if you could monitor your microbiome every time you went to the toilet? And there's a innovation coming out of Stanford and other places where people are developing smart toilets attached to a mass spectrometer where you can actually get a readout of what your microbiome is today. On top of that, then there are smart pills where people are swallowing pills that can actually tell us what's going on in our small intestine, because a lot of the microbiome measurements we're looking at in humans is just what the body is getting rid of, but maybe it's what we're keeping that's really important and what they're doing in the small intestines. So I think having these types of devices could be really cool. And again, to help people take agency over their own healthcare will be really important.
Professor John Cryan, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. We usually just leave one last opportunity for the speaker. I guess, what are the parting messages that you would want to leave the listeners with?
I guess my parting message is that it is important to mind your microbes, to look after your mind.
Professor John Cryan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you all.